and welcome to Nana's Crafty Home. My name is Tanya. Today's tutorial is going to show you how to crochet the Tunisian Full Stitch. This Tunisian stitch is very easy, 2-row repeat, and I am going to show you how to work this stitch in a solid color as well as how to create this beautifully unique woven look with just 2 different colors of yarn. I have a solid color. This is Lion Brand Heartland in Capital Reef, and then I'm using Lion Brand Landscapes Fusion yarn as my second color. Both of these are a medium 4-weight yarn. You can use any weight that you would like for your project. I am going to be using a size K or a 6.5 millimeter crochet hook. This is a Tunisian crochet hook. A Tunisian crochet hook is going to have this attachment or on the end with a stopper, or you're going to have a long crochet hook that also has a stopper on the end. Basically, you're working Tunisian, keeping your stitches on your hook, similar to knitting, and so that's why you would want to have this stopper. If you're just using this for practice and you're just using a few stitches and you have a nice long crochet hook, you can go ahead and just practice this without a Tunisian crochet hook if you'd like as well. For the Tunisian Full Stitch, you can use any number of chains for your project. I will be using 28 chains for my sample today. Let's go ahead and get started. So to begin, I'm going to chain 28, but you can chain any number of chains for your foundation chain for this stitch. So I've chained for my foundation row, and for that foundation row, I'm going to work it as I would for any other foundation row in Tunisian. I'm going to pick up a loop from the back bump in the second chain and then in each chain to the end. And of course that first loop counts as my first stitch. So I'm going to skip that first bump here and insert my hook into that second bump, yarn over and pull up a loop. So that's 2 stitches, and I'm going to continue working in that back bump of each stitch or each chain, yarning over and pulling up a loop, and just continue that all the way down your chain. So I've completed my forward pass for my foundation row, and I will have 28 loops on my hook, which is the same number of chains that I started with. And now we're ready to work our return pass for our foundation row, and we're going to work that just as we normally would by yarning over, and we will pull through 1 loop to create that slip stitch, and then we will yarn over and pull through 2, and we will repeat that throughout the remainder. So yarning over, pull through 2, yarning over, pulling through 2, yarning over, pulling through 2, and continue that down for your return pass. So I've completed my foundation row, and I'm ready to begin for row 2, which is actually my first row worked in the Tunisian Full Stitch. So for the Tunisian Full Stitch, we're going to be inserting our hook between the vertical bars and pushing our hook all the way through to the back side. For row 2, I'm going to insert my hook into each stitch between these vertical bars, and then I'm going to skip my last space. So for this row, I'm going to insert my hook into that space between these 2 vertical bars, insert it all the way through to the back side, straight through, yarning over and pulling up a loop. The first loop on our hook counts as our first stitch, so I have 2 stitches here. Now I'm going to insert my hook between these next 2 vertical bars all the way through to the back side, straight through, yarning over, pulling up a loop. And I'm just going to continue repeating those steps, inserting our hook between those 2 vertical bars all the way through, yarning over and pulling up a loop. Insert hook between the 2 vertical bars, yarn over and pull up a loop. Insert your hook between the 2 vertical bars, yarn over, pull up a loop. Now we've reached the end of our forward pass, and you can see here I have my end stitch here in that last vertical bar. But because for this row I inserted my hook into that very first space, I'm going to skip this last space and work my end stitch. And the reason being is if I were to insert my hook and pull up a loop, I would be increasing my stitch count for this row. And we want to remain at that same 28 stitches for each of our rows. So we're going to be alternating, skipping that first stitch at the beginning and skipping that last stitch at the end from row to row so that we can maintain our stitch count and we can keep our edges straight. So again, because I inserted my hook into the first space at the beginning of this row, I'm going to skip this last space at the end of this, and I'm going to work my end stitch, and my end stitch will be worked the same throughout, just inserting my hook and yarning over and pulling up a loop. And then verify that you have 28 stitches. So you count each of these loops on your hook. Each loop counts as a stitch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 26, 27, 28. So I've maintained my stitch count. I'm ready to work my return pass, and all my return passes will be the same. So I'm going to yarn over and just pull through that 1 loop, then yarn over, pull through 2, 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 and continue repeating that throughout your return pass to complete row 2. We're ready for row 3, and again, like I mentioned in that previous row, we need to alternate skipping stitches. So because I worked in that first space, I'm going to skip the first space of this row and work in the second space. So you can see these 2 vertical bars here. I don't want to work between those 2 vertical bars. I want to skip those and work into the next. So insert my hook, yarn over, and pull up a loop. And then just repeat, inserting our hook between the next 2 vertical bars, yarn over, and pull up a loop. And repeat that all the way down your row. Now when I get to the end of that row, because I skipped that first space, I now want to work in the last space between that last vertical bar here and my end stitch. So this row, I'm going to insert my hook into that space. So you can open it up with your fingers if you're having trouble finding it. Yarning over, pulling up a loop, and then working your end stitch, inserting your hook under those 2 loops at the end, and yarn over, pull up a loop. And again, you should have 28 loops on your hook to maintain your stitch count, or whatever stitch count you may have for your project. And then your return pass is worked exactly the same. Yarning over, pulling through just one, yarning over, pulling through two, yarning over, pulling through two, and continuing that to finish your return pass. So we've completed row 3, and we're just going to be alternating those rows, skipping the first stitch as I did in that last row, and then working in your end, or working in the first stitch and skipping your last. And you're going to alternate back and forth to the size desired in your pattern. Now you're going to say, well, what happens if I get interrupted? I'm working on a big project and I forgot what I did in my last row. Did I skip the first stitch or did I work in that first stitch? Because that's going to make a difference in what you do at the end of your row. So when I pick up my work, and maybe it's been a while since I've picked it up and I'm trying to remember what did I do in that last row. So I'm going to show you here what to look for. So in this last row that I worked, you can see that I worked between the second set of vertical bars. If you open up your work, you can see in that previous row I skipped that first stitch working in the second. So now I know that I want to work in the first stitch and skip the last stitch for this next row. So insert your hook into that first space between your vertical bars and yarn over and pull up a loop. And then just work it the same until you get to the end, and you will skip that last space. And what happens if you get to the end of your row, you were distracted, you forgot what you did at the beginning of your row, just come back. What did you do? So open it up if you need to, pull it open, and you can see that you worked in your first stitch. So you have this loop coming out between those two vertical bars of this row, so you know you worked that stitch in the first space. So what does that mean? At the end, I'm going to skip that last space and I'm going to work my end stitch. And then work your return pass as normal. Now I'm going to show you how to work the stitch in two colors. I have a project coming up that I'm releasing, actually a couple of projects, that I'm going to be using two colors, creating a meshed appearance. It's really beautiful and woven looking at the end of your project. So I'm going to show you how to change those colors, but keeping it to where you don't have a lot of extra ends to weave in. So for this next row, I'm going to work with my original color and I'm going to work in that second stitch because I want to skip this first stitch, because you can see in that previous row I worked in the first stitch, so I'm going to work in the second and just work it as I normally would. Your forward pass is going to be worked, and then you're going to pull in the next color with your return pass. And we'll just drop this working yarn to pull in my new color. And you can do this at any point. You can start changing colors at any point in your project pretty easily, just by dropping your yarn after your forward pass and then pull it in for your return pass. So for this row, because I skipped that first stitch, I'm going to want to work between that space at the end, work my final end stitch there, Still going to have 28 stitches, and now I'm going to pull in my next color. So I'm just going to pull it in with my slip stitch through that first loop. I dropped that color that I was working with, and now for my return pass, I'm working with my new color. So I'm just going to complete my return pass by yarning over and pulling through 2, yarning over, pulling through 2, and then just, as I normally would, finish my return pass. I'm going to continue working with this same yarn, and I'm going to work my next row. So for my next row, you can see that I skipped my first stitch in that previous row, so I'm going to work in that first stitch and work my forward pass just as I normally would. At the end of that row, because I worked in my first stitch, I'm going to skip that last stitch and I'm going to work my end stitch. And you're going to have, again, 28 stitches. And now I want to pull back in the other color. So I'm going to drop this yarn and I'm going to pull my first color back into my work. You're going to want to make sure and pull on that so that you don't have a big gap, large stitches here on the side. Don't pull it too tightly. You don't want to crunch your work up there on the end. And you're just, again, just going to drop that other color, pull this back into your work by working your yarn over and pulling through just the one loop. And then completing your return pass just as you normally would by yarning over and pulling through 2. So I've completed that row, and to continue on changing colors, I would work my forward pass in that next row with that same color and then change, drop this current yarn, pulling in the yarn that I dropped for my return pass. And you would just continue doing that as long as you wanted to continue changing colors. And you can see how pretty that is. Creates this really unique look. By dropping and pulling our yarn back in, we don't have a lot of extra ends to weave in, which is great. Now you can see this stitch does have a tendency to curl. I would say it's a moderate curl here on the end, and each end would have that issue. So when you go to bind off, you're going to have curling issues on this side as well as on the beginning foundation side of your work. You can help make allowances for that by adding a border, by blocking, or by sewing the ends together. If you have a project where you're sewing the ends like a hat or a scarf or something like that, that would help alleviate some of that. Blocking will help alleviate it. But you can see it's a pretty dense fabric, so great project for scarves, hats, anything to help keep you warm. There's not a lot of gaps between these stitches, so a nice dense fabric. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial today. Thanks so much for being with me. As always, remember to subscribe to my YouTube channel so you never miss a new video. Thanks everyone. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.